Thanks so much, Flora.
Yeah, it's great to be here today. I know we've been, big fans of SOFA for quite a few years now. We learned about y'all through the Foundation for Intentional Communities, and these resources were shared in some classes that we took there on starting a community. And yeah, just, excited to share what we've learned from bringing what we've been practicing and what we've learned from Sociocracy. And also, I think that especially because it's not that large of a group, I definitely want to have a lot of space to hear what are your questions with this? What projects are you working on? And for this to be a collaborative space.
Yeah, so we'll share a little bit more about ourselves and then a little bit more about our collective afterwards and invite you to do the same. Thank you to everyone who's been introducing themselves in the chat so far. My name is Stas. I use they, them pronouns. I'm one of the co-founders of Spring Up Collective, and I also have the formal title of the Imaginatrix. I kind of am in the middle of all our curriculum design work. And I also write speculative fiction and like to bring that into the world building that we do in our collective and with partners and clients. And we are on the ancestral and current lands of Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne people in Denver, Colorado. And something that has been bringing me joy recently is that some friends of ours and one of our collective members is part of a land-based project in New Mexico that we got to go to and camp for a week and build and farm and make things with our hands and learn more about the indigenous history of the area from local elders. And it was just a really, really beautiful space. And we're trying to get ourselves together to go back again at the end of the month if we have the energy. So that's been bringing me a ton of joy.
Yeah, my name is Leander. I use he or they pronouns. Stas and I have been collaborating for about 11 years,
12.
12 years, and we've been married for 3 years. So we've just been very deep in partnership with each other and lots of other people. And yeah, Sociocracy has been a really amazing resource and tool for us and something that we send clients and collaborators to all the time. Something that's been bringing me joy recently is we were able to see the aurora here, and it was actually at a graduation party for our friend who was studying physics in a way that kind of relate to that sort of phenomenon. So it felt like a really big like alignment there and cool to just see that with someone who could like kind of explain to us what was going on. And yeah, I was grateful also to be with people because I don't think that I would have remembered that it was happening, especially in the middle of the night. So yeah, that was just like a really cool experience to be able to see that in Colorado.
I love how much folks' joy is coming from nature and relationships and making things. I definitely feel some like synergy and connection there. So that's exciting.
Yeah, and you're also welcome to share if you have access needs. I think, do we have captions
Yeah, the
turned on?
caption should be enabled. And so you should be able to put those there. And then we will have a optional somatic exercise before we dive in. That's totally up to you if you want to participate. You can opt out if it doesn't feel right for you. And if there are any other ways that we can support you in meeting your needs, feel free to message us. You can ask me to slow down, things like that. I think we have, yeah, a brief grounding. So this is totally optional for you. Do we want to do butterfly tapping?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so since this is connected to harm and conflict, we support a lot of groups in integrating conflict as a generative force. Our background is in community-based responses to gender-based violence, and we've done a lot of work in community around that. And so this is a really brief exercise that can support folks in just like settling their nervous system, going into difficult conversations or processing a situation. And so it's called butterfly tap or bilateral stimulation. And what you do is you take your hands and cross them to create a butterfly or anything that kind of causes one hand to touch the other side of your body, but butterflies can really help. And you put it on your chest and tap in whatever cadence feels good. You can go back and forth. You can do them both at the same time. And when we tap the opposite side of our body, it activates our vagus nerve and kind of calms the nervous system. And so we'll just take a couple moments. You can close your eyes, settle on something in the space, think about the things that have been bringing you joy that you shared. Just take a couple moments to attune to your breath and find a cadence with the tapping.
Yeah, and you can experiment with tapping softer or harder, faster or slower, just kind of building that communication between your brain and your body. And also just deepening your breath by about 10%. Yeah, and when you feel ready, you can stop the tapping and just leave your hands applying gentle pressure. Yeah, thank you for joining us in that. And then I know we always like to do just a little intuitive stretch after that. And yeah, doing Zoom-based work, I think there's a lot of benefits in terms of access. We're all over the world talking to each other. And also we find that it's important to bring the body into it and also to just be explicit about the fact that this is your space. Get up, walk around, get a snack, do, whatever you need to do to be present here.
Yeah, so we have the closed captions, some ways that we like to encourage people to participate, especially if you don't have fully formed thoughts that you want to share in the chat. You can put pluses in the chat to indicate your resonance with what's being shared. So if we say something and you're like, wow, that really hits home, you don't have to type up, this really resonated with me for these reasons. You can just put pluses. And the number of pluses indicate how excited you are about what's being shared. And I will just name that if no one puts any pluses, I will be like, oh my gosh, they hate what we're saying. So like, be generous with it if it feels good. We appreciate it. And we definitely encourage you to, share out loud if you'd like to. Sometimes putting the hand up function can feel kind of like aggressive. So we often will have people put an asterisk in the chat to indicate if they want to speak. And then when we're at a pausing point, we'll invite you to share.
Yeah.
Was someone saying something? No? Okay, that's fine. And then I will try to speak slowly. Sometimes I speak really quickly. If I'm going too quickly, please feel free to put in the chat, slow down or breathe. I will not be offended. It's very helpful. I also encourage you to ask questions as they come up. You don't have to wait until the end of the time. I know sometimes if I try to wait until the end, I'm like, why was I even asking that question? Or I'll forget it. I'd rather hear the question as it surfaces within the context that prompted it. So please do ask questions as they arise.
Yeah, and I'd also encourage you, I know we're all working on very specific projects in very particular locations. You don't need to make a question generic to see if it'll apply to everyone. I would say we can learn through the specifics, and if it does feel like it doesn't apply to where we're going with the content, we'll just table it for later and see if we have time to come back to it at the end. But, use the space for what would be helpful to you.
Yeah, and then the last two are just like, if you know that this is helpful for you, like come in, ask the questions, use the space. And if you're like, I'm kind of just here to listen, that's okay to move back. Just kind of take up the space that feels right for you. If someone has been really present the entire time, we might ask to pause and see if anyone else has questions, but we trust you to self-regulate around that. And then especially with the topics of harm and conflict, we'd love to go deep in this conversation with you, but not so deep that anyone feels overwhelmed, right? And so just thinking about what's the right depth to share when you're talking about a specific situation or thinking about your own kind of what's coming up for you. We're looking for depth without drowning. And the last thing is from our friends at Project Let's, which is a disability justice network across universities. And they say, please use the space you are in as you need or prefer. This includes rocking, flapping, stimming, sitting down, standing up, lying on the floor, moving around, stepping in and out of the room, turning on your video or off your video. I know I always have kind of fidgets with me. This is a space where we encourage you to do what feels good for you, and to feel that this is a space where you can be, whatever version of yourself is ready to show up right now. And so there's no shame. There's a lot of joy in seeing your fidgets if you want to bring it into the space, laying down if it feels better for your body, doing whatever is going to be best for you throughout the space.
Yeah, and then we also have several animals with us, so maybe they'll make an appearance on the video screen.
Okay, so who is Spring Up? We are two of the co-founders of an abolitionist collective, and we are a worker co-op practicing and teaching the skills to be free together. We cultivate a culture of consent and liberty for all through storytelling and popular education. We offer consulting, coaching for individuals as well as groups, conflict mediation, and we host 6-week and 6-month cohort courses, day-long virtual retreats, webinars, all at our online school, Blue Light Academy of the Liberatory Arts.
Mhm. And yeah, I think that what feels important to say is that this collective is one of our primary practice spaces. We live all over the United States and folks travel a lot. And so I think this collective is one of many projects for most people in the group, but we come together to practice new structures, build our consent skills. This collective has been active for, this is now our 11th year. Nearly all of the members have been part of it for at least 3 years. Many people we've known for decades. And so this is our little experimentation and practice space. And then we apply those skills by teaching and training and consulting together.
And we are structured in an adapted version of Sociocracy. And so we have different circles, and those are each self-directed. And it allows for everyone to kind of pursue things that they're excited about within this umbrella of getting free together, without needing to kind of get approval from anyone. So we wanted to ground in some shared definitions that feel important when we're talking about non-punitive harm response. What do we mean by that? And so the first one is thinking about the difference between disagreement, conflict, and harm. So disagreement means that there's a lack of consensus or agreement. There are different opinions. And the metaphor we like to think of here is with pizza toppings. So in a group, people often disagree about what is the best pizza. People may really dislike the pizza that other people like, and those are just disagreements, and it's fine, and we can move on and have different desires when it comes to pizza. Conflict, on the other hand, is disagreement that's stemming from deeply rooted opposing wants and needs. These could be opposing interests, values, and directions. And this is often what that disagreement looks like when we're collaborating with one another or need to make a shared decision.
So, it's great for people to disagree. When conflict comes in, it often means that we need to make a compromise or make a decision together. And so in this pizza example, we disagree, maybe there's also like someone's vegan, someone,
Gluten intolerant.
hates pineapple, right? So we have these strongly opposing wants and needs, and we need to order food together. And the stakes would be raised, as it often happens in group projects, if there's a limited budget and, for example, we can only order 2 pizzas. So that starts to kind of bring it a little more into the realm of we feel differently, we have different needs, and we're going to need to move through that and come up with a decision together.
What's relevant, this is a quote by James Baldwin that says, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." So I think it's important to keep in mind that we can kind of be like, oh, pizza toppings, whatever. But if we're kind of making fun of the idea that someone is celiac and gluten intolerant, then we're kind of turning that disagreement into something that's invalidating someone's experience and identity, right? And so I think it's important to keep in mind that while we can disagree about a lot of things, there are certain things that when we disagree about them, they fundamentally create not just conflict, but often harm. And that brings us to what is harm. So harm is when the actions of a person or a group of people or even a system have a negative impact on another person or group of people that creates unmet needs and obligations. This is often an abuse of power. Keep in mind, there are always power differences, and it's about negotiating them equitably and consensually. So this is a definition coming out of restorative justice, which is saying that once harm has occurred, it actually presents a need and an obligation to meet that need. And that's at the core of why we're addressing the harm, not because a rule was broken or that something was just bad, but that it's actually grounded in the impacts that it had on people or groups and tending to the relationships that are present there.
Yeah, and especially through the lens of restorative justice, this doesn't mean like, oh no, we hurt each other, we can never, work together or be friends again. Instead, it's a call to examine, why did this happen, and what sort of repair or learning needs to happen for us to be able to move forward and either set different boundaries or, even deepen our relationship or collaboration.
So what this might look like with the pizza example is if there's a person in the group that's vegan and just over and over again, the person who's ordering food is just not getting any vegan options or just always getting the same basic romaine salad that they've communicated multiple times. This is not going to meet my needs. And it's causing that person to need to pay out of pocket to get additional food, to have their needs not be taken seriously. That can then be creating harm for that person because they can't eat or they're having financial damages. This is, again, a very simple example, but it's to try to discern the difference between these different things. And part of why we're communicating about this is because at the source of our inability to see conflict as a generative force is often when we don't have shared definitions about these things. And only when we're able to actually understand what is harm and how is it different from conflict can we see conflict as something that can actually strengthen our relationships, help us get more creative, come up with a path forward, and take harm seriously when it occurs, and have an effective path forward to address it.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions before we keep moving?
Yes. I'm assuming that both can happen at the same time, right? And I guess that's part of where things can get blurry because I'm assuming people can both harm each other during a conflict. So maybe you're about to get into that, but when I'm hearing what you're saying, there's part of me that's like, okay, that's a nice stepping stone for me. We can talk about the difference in definitions, but then I can recall instances where it's the moments when it's all entangled and everybody's harmed each other that are really messy.
Yeah, because the subjectivity, like people might, experience the same incident in ways that for some people feel like, low stakes disagreement, and that for some people feel harmful. And I think that's where even just introducing this language, then you could have a community conversation about like, what happened? How did we experience that? Why are certain people experiencing it differently?
I think also many of us were socialized in environments to be extremely conflict avoidant and to experience any kind of conflict as harmful. And so being able to have this separation can really help us to be able to say, okay, what about what's happening is just that we're in conflict and we need to work through it? And what about what's happening is having unmet needs and obligations that need to be met, right? Like, I think that being able to tease that out and actually be able to tell the difference is very helpful. Sometimes we'll also share the definition of hurt, which is hurt is an activation of a previous harm. So for example, this is moving away from the pizza example, but say I had a cut on my shoulder and you didn't know that I have this shirt on and Lee brushes on this cut. I might feel really upset about that, even though it was a small little brush. And that's because it activated my hurt. And so that doesn't mean that it's not valid pain, but it does shift the onus of responsibility to address what came up and the kind of conversation you have about what happened and what it means for our relationship moving forward, right? So if I have a cut, I'm not going to be like, you're responsible for the gash that I had. How could you have done this to me? Instead, I'm going to be like, this opened up a conversation for me to share a little bit more about what happened so that we can be in right relationship with one another. Kazuhaga in the book Healing.
Fumbling towards repair.
No, that's Miriam Kaba. It's Kazuhaga is the healing. I don't remember right now, but in the book, Kazuhaga says, conflict is the relationship asking itself to deepen. And I think about how, yes, healing resistance, thank you. And so that's really thinking about how might the situation be causing us to understand each other a little bit better, understand the resources that we have a little bit better, be able to avoid some of this in the future, as well as tend to the pain that was surfaced. I think all of these are not about invalidating one person's experience, but it's about getting specific enough to be able to know what it calls for us to do next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and great point, Michael, that the presence of conflict is really healthy for a group because it indicates that we have folks from different backgrounds with different needs and experiences present who are also choosing to bring up those issues to each other, which indicates the, at least some presence of trust.
And not just diversity, but also a different relationship to power. In extremely hierarchical spaces, conflict is almost always resolved by the person who has the most power making the decision. And so if we are having different opinions and actually working through the intensity of everyone's opinion being valid and figuring out a path forward, that likely is indicative of a different relationship to power within the group, which is actually a really positive thing.
Yeah. Okay. So conflict, disagreement, and harm are present. And the next thing we're going to talk about is accountability. So whose, responsibility or accountability is it to hold what comes up?
And part of the importance here is when we say non-punitive harm response, people often are like, so it's nothing, you just let it happen, right? That it's either punishment or we don't care. And so the question is, what is the alternative to punishment that is taking harm seriously and doing something about it, but not creating more harm through the response process? And for us, that is accountability. So these are two definitions of accountability that are really helpful to us. And as I read this, I'm curious for you to think about how might this be different from how you've thought about accountability before? What might be some of the implications of defining accountability this way? And then I'd love to hear from a couple folks, either unmuting or in the chat, talking through that. So the first definition is from Connie Burke. And Connie says, accountability is an internal resource for recognizing and redressing the harms we have caused to ourselves and to others. And then in the book Fumbling Toward Repair, Mariam Kaba and Shira Hassan share that there is no way to hold people accountable. People can only take accountability. Accountability is a continuous, active, and voluntary process of being responsible to yourself and those around you for your choices and the consequences of your choices. Unlike punishment, it is something that we do rather than something that is done to us. So I'd love to hear from a couple folks, what's standing out to you from these definitions? How might these be different from things you've heard before? What might be some of the implications of these definitions? And you're very welcome to unmute and share aloud.
And I want to point out too that this is about personal accountability. So how does the individual relate to these things? We're going to get into community accountability and organizational accountability after this. But right now we're thinking about how does the individual enter into that? Just reading from the chat, self-responsibility lining up with accountability as a behavior resonates with me.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that stood out to me in these definitions when I first looked at them, is both of them talk about the harm we've caused to ourselves and then to others, and that almost being accountable for the harm that we commit against ourselves is nearly a prerequisite to being able to be effectively accountable to other people.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from one or two other people if you have any questions that this brings up or any, reactions to this. Yeah, and we don't need to call on you. You can just unmute.
Oh, sure. So how do you get, I guess, members of the group to be intrinsically motivated to do this, Chuck?
That is the correct question. I think that sometimes when we talk to groups about kind of the flip side, which is why wouldn't people do this, is that the incentive system of the society tends to be that if you acknowledge that you committed harm, everyone turns on you.
Or
And
get in trouble, right? Yeah.
it justifies punishment. And so we actually have really strong incentive systems to stop people from practicing this. And so within our communities, it is up to us to shift that incentive system to actually have it be a positive thing when people acknowledge harm and take these steps. We need to be able to model this through storytelling. We need to set up containers that encourage people to do this. We need to have repetitive experiences of people taking accountability and having that land as a positive thing. And that's part of why we encourage people to start small and build up. So when you think about, if I've never seen people model accountability in a positive sense, and then someone's bringing up an instance of, for example, sexual harm, that is such a big kind of harm that it makes sense that that maybe shouldn't be the first example of this. But if instead we're talking about accountability around just not getting your tasks done on time, or not communicating proactively when you said that you would, or in transformative justice, we're always talking about doing the dishes, and people say they're going to do the dishes, they don't do the dishes, there are excuses around the dishes.
They have to be done every week or often every day.
Or
right?
for us, it's cleaning up the litter, right? How can we model the accountability around that when it's a small enough scale that people build up that muscle, so that as larger harms occur, we can trust that the community is set up to be able to encourage accountability?
Yeah, and there's lots of opportunities for decentralized leadership in this as well, of apologizing for small things. Like, you don't need someone to be mad at you for not preparing the meeting notes. You can just say, hey, we're starting this. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to pull together an agenda. Can we spend 10 minutes and maybe I'll make an agenda together? That's like an example of just apologizing. You don't need to be defensive or like blame someone, but just saying I'm sorry. And then also modeling accountability as well, right? And having it actually be an important thing that's worth noticing when you say like, hey, I'm gonna come do this with you, and then you don't show up. That's something that's worth like acknowledging and apologizing for, even before the person says like, hey, it hurt my feelings that you didn't follow through on what you said you were going to do. And that's how we build small steps of modeling that we're a community that values accountability, and that it's safe to, people go into a shame spiral even when they're like, oh, I didn't respond to your email. It's like, just normalize saying like, hey, I was busy. I'm sorry that I didn't get to this. And you're welcome to tell me, any impacts that had on you. Like, I'd be happy to hear about that.
I think it's Danielle Sered who says that accountability is to the person who caused harm what forgiveness is to the person who experienced harm, that it's actually primarily healing for the person who's actively doing it. And that being able to take accountability is soothing and healing an open wound when you've harmed and kind of separated from another person.
Yeah, so I think peer modeling is really important here. And then to make it more explicit, I'm such a big like proponent of community peer-led education and having that be a part of our like communities and like projects being learning spaces. And so you can also, like any of these texts that we're citing, you can say, hey, let's like do this as a co-reading. This is important for me to like, I'd love if we could spend some time learning together about this. And then, like we said about the first things, then you have that language to start noticing like things using that.
Yeah, we have a zine about transformative justice that goes through a lot of this. And we also have like book lists that cover these different things and courses and mini classes and stuff. So a lot to dig in deeper. And then Puck, I saw that you said you've always thought of accountability as holding each other accountable. So this is a shift in framing. Yeah, I think that a lot of people hear of it that way. And so it's been really interesting for me to think back on when have people actually taken accountability and kind of realizing that in each of those situations, they did end up choosing that. Like they did choose to show up in that way, and that you can certainly shift the incentive systems. I'm an organizer at heart. And so like, if people are not taking accountability, you can absolutely escalate the consequences of not doing that. That shifts the kind of onus to need to do it. But because I'm so deeply committed to a politic of consent, I fundamentally believe that if people do choose to be accountable, it is the choice that they made in that situation. Yeah, we'll share some more links as well. Our website is timetosspring.org, and we have a ton of free resources on there, as well as a link to our online academy that has mini classes about this. There are free videos. There's and we also have book lists that are linked there. Okay, so that brings us kind of scaling up from personal accountability into community accountability. And part of the reason why we do this is that we fundamentally believe that people need to be bought into the concept of personal accountability in order to effectively practice this as a community. And people in the community need to agree with this idea of accountability in order to implement it effectively through policies and systems in an organization on a formal level.
Yeah, and so I think that not only is it extremely compatible with self-governance, I think it's necessary to self-governance to kind of be building these skills and the ability to have these conversations.
So community accountability is a collection of strategies that use pre-existing relationships and community to prevent, intervene in, respond to, and heal from instances of harm. And we've learned a lot about this from Mimi Kim and Creative Interventions, some mentors of ours. They have some really wonderful free resources specifically about community accountability when it comes to gender-based violence. But when we're thinking about this in our work with one another, there are often two facets that are important to think about, which is task accountability or follow through around what you said you will do. And kind of the reason why we're often together is because we're trying to do something together. And so accountability around that stuff that we're doing together. And then there's also relational accountability, being accountable to those that you are in continued community with, and recognizing that what it means to be accountable is different in different relationships. What it means for me to be accountable to my life partner of 11 years, who I co-parent 5 animals with, looks different from what it looks like for me to be accountable with other collective members that I work on discrete projects with. And so just recognizing that those are adaptive and specific, and you need to really get to know someone and have explicit agreements with one another in order to effectively tend to that relational accountability in a way that's unique to that relationship.
Yeah, and something I'd encourage you to think about is what are communities or projects you've been part of where task accountability is first and foremost valued, and what are spaces you've been a part of where relational accountability is kind of, more important. And we believe that they are kind of equally important. When you don't do the things that you say you'll do, it damages trust, and often there are people that are impacted by that inaction, or even harmed by that inaction. And then the relational accountability, if you're always just focused on, you said you'd do this, I need this, then it really damages the relationship that you have with that person and the idea that you feel that you care about each other. And so I think trust and care are words that then start to come up a lot when you're actually surfacing these and having conversations about those. And that those are also, I think, good things to have conversations about as a team or as like people who live together, is just like, it doesn't have to be about something that went wrong, but just like, what does trust mean to us? Like, when do you feel a sense of being trusted? What are things that I've done that have damaged your trust? How do you, like, what makes you feel cared for, and just having those conversations proactively can improve the dynamic so much, whether it's with housemates or collaborators.
And then if we scale up further from this, because community accountability really is a bit more of like an organic interpersonal practice, then we're thinking about organizational accountability and how do we bring these practices into our structures in order for us to be able to rely on them regardless of what our interpersonal relationships look like. And so we kind of come from a background of doing community accountability. We do organizational consulting and have thought over about the last 8 years that we've been working with groups, how can we adapt some of these concepts to kind of name what that looks like within structures that are grounded in these shared values? So organizational accountability, similar to community accountability, is a collection of strategies, philosophies, and systems that organizations, collectives, and coalitions can embrace to practice collective accountability or community accountability that we had from the last slide. This practice grounds itself in who the organization is accountable to and what it is accountable for, governance and feedback systems that center those who are directly impacted by the organization's mission and vision. And some core facets of practicing this include translating our values into practice, practicing generative conflict with one another, preventing and responding to harm without overly centering liability or the state, and responding to patterns of harm and conflict through emergent and adaptive organizational strategy.
Yeah, and what we're going to get into next is what are practices to do this specifically within sociocracy. But while we're on this slide, I just wanted to point out that the idea of figuring out who you're accountable to can be very aligned with figuring out what is the aim of a circle, and particularly what are the feedback mechanisms around that. How do you know if you're achieving your aim? Who are you getting input from? Who decides if the aim has been accomplished or needs to be changed? That can be really compatible with that. And then that we have seen organizations operate in a lot of different ways, but we really do think that sociocracy is one of the most effective governance and feedback mechanisms to center the people that are directly impacted by decisions.
Yeah, so what we mean by the state and liability is that often when groups are formally incorporated as whether it's a 501c3 or another type of structure, the mechanism for responding to harm tends to be centered in HR or something that is about understanding the company's liability in what occurred. And so in supporting organizations, sometimes we'll see that they don't take seriously a harm that's occurred unless it requires a formal HR investigation. Like they're like, oh, is this officially
Like harassment.
yeah, and that means something very specific legally, and it also requires a very specific type of response. And when we support organizations, sometimes we'll see them say, well, this person wasn't found guilty of harassment, so I guess it's just fine. When in fact, that person is harming people, it just doesn't meet the kind of government's definition of something that requires a legal intervention. And so we're talking about centering harm, which we defined earlier, rather than the law and the government's requirement for intervention.
Yeah, and so I think the reason why we're labeling those things of state liability, the law, is that that's in contrast with self-governing grassroots projects that are mostly grounded in values and relationships and like what are our goals, what are we building together, and that you don't want to be negligent about when people are being harmed. But what we've found is that when it's the community caring about and valuing the people that are part of it, that actually the barrier for accountability can be much higher. There's an understanding that, oh, if we're not in a formal structure with a board, with lawyers on staff, then, nobody will care if people are being hurt. But instead, when groups are practicing this effectively, which does take a lot of skill and kind of, buy-in from the community, that those can be some of the most like caring and safe learning communities also, where people aren't kicked out just because they don't already have all the same references, but the community can surface things that aren't working and learn through those together.
Yeah, so I'd love to pivot into what can this look like in a sociocratic structure. And we're sharing what it looks like within our collective as a model for how we do this. So we have a conflict and harm circle. Those have term limits in order to redistribute care labor. We found that when it was just whoever's on the conflict and harm circle, it was the same people who were doing a ton of extra emotional labor. And we believe that the skill set necessary to respond to conflict and harm is something that anyone can learn, but they'll only learn it if there's a system to encourage them to do it. And so that's, I think, important. And this is a small group. So this shouldn't be a really big group with a kind of low level of consistency. This would be a small group that's pretty committed to holding this structure. And that group either builds or already has the skills through training or experience to address conflict and harm grounded in these values. We've supported other groups who have this circle go through some of our trainings and have access to coaching with us so that they can have a group of people who aren't always holding it, hold that space and trust that they have the skills to do it.
Yeah, and something that we have in our team and programs is a survey or like a flag that people can fill out
That's
when they're noticing conflict and harm. Something I wanted to say is that this circle can also review general feedback forms or just like look at reflection documents, and they can more make noticings about what they think isn't working or what isn't aligned with the group's values, even if nobody is like reporting a specific incident of conflict or harm.
Yeah, so they're proactively flagging underlying conflicts and holding space to talk about them, even if it hasn't become like an urgent need.
We're really big advocates of prevention when it comes to conflict and harm. I think that once something has become a really active conflict or harm that, maybe a community is polarized around, people have taken sides, it does require a lot of time and energy to kind of get the group back to moving through that. But honestly, like 10% of that amount of energy on prevention can have such positive impacts on the community.
The folks in this group are also available as like peer coaches and support people. I think because these are skills that are so important to all of us as a group, we end up finding that people use these skills interpersonally pretty organically without needing to rely on this group that much. So often it's when people have tried to have a conversation directly, it's still feeling sticky, then their next step is often to get peer coaching, each person involved to talk through what's coming up and come up with a better plan forward. And if that still doesn't work, then they'll have these folks come in as support people in the situation. And we also have a former collective member who is already pre-approved to provide mediation and coaching if folks want support from someone who's familiar with what we do, but isn't actively in the collective.
And that can be really helpful to like do a little inventory thing of like who in your group knows about restorative justice or mediation, or is there a community member who's already familiar with you and what you do, who can be an outside resource in that.
So then we have this flag form. And what's helpful about this is even if people don't use the form, they use the questions on the form to think through what's happening. And so this form, anyone in the network can fill it out, can to surface or inform us of an issue. Even if it's already being addressed, they might just fill it out to let us know that it happened and what happened so that we can notice trends across what's been occurring, even if they're not requesting further support. It's grounded in restorative justice. and abolition. So we're pretty explicit about never calling in an outside person unless it's directly requested by the person involved. That survey also names the options and resources for response so that people can check what they're looking for. And that's listed on the next slide. It also has this question that people find very helpful. It's not meant to be an objective scale of like, objectively, is this disagreement or conflict? But the person involved can kind of name the intensity of what's going on that will shape the way that we'll respond. So what's interesting is when we've had people involved in a conflict, sometimes each person in the conflict rates the conflict very differently on this scale. And at least it helps us to perceive how they're viewing the situation differently. So it's a 1 to 10 scale. 1 to 4 tends to be more like a tension or a friction or a disagreement. 4 to 6 would tend to be a conflict, and 6 to 10 would be harm. And it's really interesting to see. I'm going to show you on the next slide what are the options for response. But it includes some framing from nonviolent communication, like when this happened, I felt this way, and now I need this in order to move forward. And the options for response that are coordinated by the circle, even if they themselves don't provide it, include restorative dialogue, having support people or coaches come in to support on the situation, pre-conferencing, which is basically when you meet with each person separately to talk through their needs before they meet with one another, mediation, peacekeeping circles, which would be with the entire community talking through what happened rather than a small group or one-on-one, and accountability processes, which is a much more intensive 8-step process that tends to take 1 to 2 years to complete. And that would be when there's a pattern of more intense harm that everyone needs to really take seriously and address. We would do an accountability process, which we have kind of an outline of the 8 steps and the roles involved. And we also have a mutual aid fund that people can tap if there have been financial damages or they want support to be able to meet their needs. And money is the main thing that can support them in doing that.
Yeah, so it's helpful to have people with some degree of conflict navigation experience joining that circle, or people who are very willing to learn to like do some training. That doesn't have to be like, just it could be reading some books together. But you can see these are many different skill sets, and it does require quite a bit of skill to see what's going on and say, do we need a community conversation about this, or should we just start with a private, like, one-on-one thing?
Yeah, and we hold trainings on pretty much all of these topics to help people learn to be able to do them independently.
Yeah, and I'll also say that you're very welcome to reach out for more, like, if you have more questions. We have a collaborate with us form on our website that we already shared. And so if you have like, a specific situation that you'd like input on, you're welcome to share that there.
Yeah, and how to work with me guides are a free downloadable form that we have on our website that invites people to outline their relationship to conflict, their availability, how they approach feedback, so you can have proactive conversations with one another about how you intend to navigate these issues. You can also have understanding circles to build familiarity with restorative justice practices and kind of talk about these in a more abstract sense rather than tied to a specific harm. And you can really invest in skills building, whether that's doing a reading list together, or joining a training or hiring a partner that can support you. You can also audit your existing systems, and we have a day-long retreat called the Harm Systems Design Retreat that will walk you through each of these systems and provide models of what that can look like. And so that invites you to map what harm and conflict already looks like, identify what mechanisms and containers you have for people to bring up issues with one another, map out your boundaries around what you have the capacity to address and what you don't have the capacity to address. Get clear on what philosophies and tools you use when you're addressing conflict and harm. Be explicit about what legal requirements you do have, and be more explicit about your values and approach. So I just wanted to share, you can stay in touch with us. We have a bunch of free stuff on our website. You can come to our courses. You can email us. Lee just put their email in the chat. We have upcoming courses and webinars, including one tomorrow. So I'll stop sharing. I know we're at the end of our time.
But yeah, thanks so much. Yes, and as you can see, this is the start of a conversation. But you know, we're very available and so willing to continue that conversation with you. And yeah, just good luck on your journey of building these out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank everybody for attending. If you'd like to donate to Sociocracy for All, I put a link in the chat. And then I also invite you to attend the closing ceremony or moments with Ted Rao, which is starting, I think, about now. And I hope to see you there. I feel enriched, yeah, from the inside out by this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. So enriching.
Yo, this was amazing.
Thank you.
Great to meet you.
Please do stay in touch.
Yes.
Bye.
I'm in France, but you hear from me, I'll email you. and
Yeah,
see what
please.
can
We
do.
have a bunch of alumni in Europe. I'm originally from Italy.
Okay, cool. Talk to you soon then.
Bye.